Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Wednesday, February 14th slate of college basketball DFS. However, it's going to be a little bit of a different episode here for you. It's been quite the busy night for me. Today is my dad's birthday. So, we was out most of the night celebrating his birthday, and just haven't had a whole lot of time to sit here and research the entire slate. And it's already 10 o'clock and I'm already exhausted. So I'm not going to be able to preview all 9 games on the slate for you. So what I'm going to give you here today on this episode is the quick picks, where I'm going to highlight the number one game that you want to be targeting on the Wednesday slate, as well as a play from the high, mid, and low tiers, for both the guard and the forward position here on this Wednesday night slate, so that way you can kind of get a feel of, where I'm going with my lineups and who I like. If you listen to the podcast like the very early part of last college basketball season, this is kind of how we used to format episodes back then. So this one's definitely going to be a little bit shorter, but hopefully I'm going to be able to go into some good detail and really profile some guys that I do like here on this Wednesday night slate. Keep in mind, this Wednesday night is Valentine's Day. So if you have a wife or a girlfriend, keep her happy. Do something nice to her so that way she can let you watch college basketball all night long. I know for me, we're going to be going out on Saturday, me and my wife, just because, life with a 5-month-old baby girl, like we want rest on weeknights. And so we are going to stay in, have a nice little steak dinner at the house Wednesday night, and then Saturday night we're going to go out and eat at a nice restaurant and let the grandparents take care of Ava for one night. So that is what we got. But anyway, hope everybody does have a good Valentine's Day out there. Remember, if you are new to the channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season. We're going to be going all the way up through March Madness. And please, if you like what you see here on this channel, please go ahead and hit that like button on YouTube, rate and review the podcast if you're listening on audio. It really does help me out a ton, and I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the number one game that I want to target here on this Wednesday night slate. And I got to be honest, it might not be the one you expect. So the game that I'm going to be going out of my way to target here on this Wednesday night slate is not the game with the highest total on the slate. In fact, this one only has a 145-point total, which is on the higher end for the slate, but it is not the absolute highest. That title belongs to Miami and Clemson, but there's some real interesting scenarios that are happening there that I think make that game a little more difficult to target. The game that I'm going to be targeting is going to be the Iowa at Maryland game. KenPom has this one projected to be Maryland 74-71 for that 145-point total. And a big reason why is because Iowa is just simply one of the best teams to target for and against in DFS. They rank 18th in the nation in tempo and 161st in the nation in defense. So you're going to get boosted possessions against a defense that is not all that hot. And Iowa plays a pretty short rotation and their usage rates are pretty condensed. So you know what you're going to be getting out of Iowa, and you really know what you're going to be getting out of this Maryland team. So the first meeting between these two teams was actually not a super high scoring game, but there was a lot of fantasy scoring in it. It finished 69-67 in favor of Maryland for only a 136-point total. But there were a few guys that were definitely able to put up a lot of fantasy points in that game, one of which was Tony Perkins. We talked about Tony Perkins of Iowa like a lot this season, but he's a guy that shoots the ball a lot. And ever since Iowa has gone to this bigger lineup where they play Peyton Sandfort at the 2 and the 3, it's been great for the usage of Tony Perkins. And he's been really great just for Iowa in general. He was able to put up in that game against Maryland 32 fantasy points against Maryland. And in 2 of the last 4 games, he has put up 40 or more fantasy points in his salary of 8,600. We really like that. What I really like, though, is that he's shown the ability to get high fantasy totals in a multitude of ways because he's so good with the peripheral stats and his usage is just so good. He can get you 40 fantasy points while only taking 7 shots, which is what he did against Minnesota. He was also able to get to the line a lot that game, taking 13 free throws. So I really like how this sets up for Tony Perkins, and I think he can repeat that success that he had in the first meeting. Now, for the rest of the Iowa side, Owen Freeman was their second best fantasy scorer in that game against Maryland. He ended up with 27.75 fantasy points in that meeting, and he only played 28 minutes because he dealt with a little bit of foul trouble. He did foul out in that game. He was guarding Julian Reese, so it makes sense that he would have a little bit of foul trouble. But Freeman had a ceiling game last time out against Minnesota, putting up 17 and 14 along with 4 blocks for 52 fantasy points. And he's a guy that, he's going to have some ceiling games. He's going to have some floor games, but he's also going to give you that high ceiling. And at $7,900, I think he's a little expensive for my taste, but I think he's got to be in play just because of the ceiling that he has. Honestly, if I was going to stack this game and I was not going to play Julian Reese from Maryland, I would want to play Owen Freeman on the Iowa side. I think one of those two big men is going to go off. The other one is very likely to be in foul trouble. Now, neither Peyton Sanford nor Ben Krikke hit 4x value in that first game against Maryland. And look, they've always been the two Iowa guys that I just haven't ever gotten super excited about because they're not great in the peripheral stats. Peyton Sanford is a good player. He's put up 40 fantasy points in 3 of the last 5, but he's very shot dependent. Like if he shoots the ball well and he gets a lot of shots, he's going to put up a lot of fantasy points, but he doesn't do enough in the peripheral stats for me. He's not consistent enough with his shot for me that I'm willing to target him at a salary of $8,200. Ben Krikke is kind of in a similar boat, right? 2 games ago, he got 18 shots, put up 28 fantasy points. The last game against Minnesota dealt with early foul trouble, only played 17 minutes, only put up 8 total fantasy points. Big time disappointment when a lot of people went to him in that game against Minnesota. So these two guys, Sanford and Krikke, to me would be pivots off of Perkins and Freeman. I think Perkins and Freeman on paper are the 2 better plays. And so I think everybody else is going to feel that way also. So if you want to lessen your ownership a little bit, you can go with Sanford and Krikke. Josh Dix is playing a ton of minutes, but I don't think he's the best fantasy option anymore. He just doesn't get a whole lot of shots, doesn't get a whole lot of usage, so he's probably a pass for me at $5,200. But I do think you need to keep an eye on Patrick McCaffrey. I think he's intriguing because of what he did last game against Minnesota. Played 25 minutes, which was the high since he came back from injury back in the middle of January. Tied his high since he came back from injury. But he also had the highest fantasy total since he came back from injury in the middle of January. And he took 12 shots. He was 7 for 12 from the field, only 2 for 5 from 3, but still, that's not terrible. And put up 27 fantasy points in that spot. So to me, he's really intriguing for that. And knowing that, let me think the best way to say this without sounding like a total jerk. So, his dad's the coach, and he's going to get minutes. He's going to get playing time. And if he plays well, he plays his way into more minutes because it's a little easier to play your son when he's playing well. So I think that he's a guy that if he gets hot, he can get real hot and give you another 27 fantasy point performance like he had against Minnesota in their last game. Now, the Maryland side, they're probably the easiest team on the slate to target for me because they have 2 players that dominate the usage, one of which is Jameer Young, who's got a 30% usage rate on the season. He's not always super efficient with it, but he doesn't need to be efficient with it to put up a lot of fantasy points. He was 3 for 17 against Rutgers. Maryland only put up 53 real points in that game, and Jameer Young still put up 35 fantasy points, which is good for 4x value. So I kind of think that 35 fantasy points is kind of like his floor in this game, and he put up 38 last time against Iowa. So I really do like Jameer Young. I love the usage, and he has ways of getting just fantasy points in bunches, and I think he's probably my overall favorite play on the slate. Now, his wingman, Julian Reese, is a guy that I like also. He's got a 25% usage rate on the season, and he's another guy that if he just stays out of foul trouble, he puts up fantasy points in bunches, right? In his last 5 games, he's got 4 games over 35 fantasy points, 2 of which were over 40, and then one of which was a foul trouble-ridden game where he only put up 8 fantasy points in 14 minutes. If he's able to stay out of foul trouble, he is like a lock to get you 30 fantasy points, and a salary of $8,100, that's very reasonable. Now, after those 2, I think that Dante Scott is kind of like the pivot. Dante Scott's a solid player. He's been playing really well lately. He's gotten more shots lately for Maryland. And I kind of think that if Young or Reese were to not get there, then that would be a situation where Scott would thrive. In the Michigan State game where Julian Reese dealt with foul trouble, Dante Scott got 19 shots up in that game, put up 31 fantasy points. So I think he's a very easy pivot off of Young or Scott and a very reasonable salary of $6,300 where he has hit 4x value in 3 of the last 4 games. Now, another thing you need to monitor for Maryland is Jordan Geronimo is questionable for this game. He did miss their last game. And what they did in that game was they started Matty Traore at the 4. He played 20 minutes, put up 14.25 fantasy points, which doesn't sound like a ton, but that's almost 5x value for a guy at a salary of $3,000. So I really do like Matty Traore if we do get news that Jordan Geronimo is going to be out. Now, the last spot in that Maryland rotation, has kind of belonged to Deshaun Harris-Smith. He's came off the bench lately, but like he's still been able to produce a little bit. Like in that game against Ohio State, he did put up 19 fantasy points on only 1 for 5 shooting. So there's a pathway there to him being successful. He hasn't been great lately though. In the first Iowa game, he played 25 minutes and only put up 8.5 fantasy points. But they've been starting another freshman, Jamie Kaiser Jr., but he hasn't been out on the court a whole lot. Like he only played 11 minutes against Ohio State in a game that he started in a game that went to double overtime. He didn't take a shot. So like there's a chance that he gets there, but it's not super likely. But you know when you play a guy who's in the starting lineup though, that they're going to play that first initial rotation. They're going to get you 10 minutes and maybe some opportunities to put up fantasy points. And for a guy at $3,500, I think he's got to be considered in this great game environment. All right, that does it for the game that I'm going to be targeting. So now let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's talk some tiers for the guard and the forward position. So now let's talk about some of my favorite plays at the guard spot, notwithstanding from the Iowa-Maryland game, because obviously you know that I love Perkins, I love Jameer Young, but from the rest of the games, other guys that I like at the guard spot. I'm going to start the list off in the high tier with Dalton Connect. So he is sitting here at $8,900, and he has just been really, really good in the last month of the season. He has a 32% shot rate on the season, but when you look at the last month of the season, pretty much dating back to January 10th, he has taken 14 or more shots from the field in every single game since January 10th. That is just an insane run. And in that span, he has only failed to hit 4x value for his current salary once. And it was against Kentucky when Tennessee put up 103 points. So kind of a little bit of irony there. But pretty much last year, Tennessee was a really good team, but they were really bad at offense. And pretty much the only thing that changed heading into this year was they added Dalton Connect. And so a lot of what they do on offense now is just like, here, Dalton, go make something happen. And so he does a lot with the ball. He takes a lot of shots, and that leads to a ton of fantasy points. He has hit 450 fantasy point outings in the last month, which means that we know he has a legitimate ceiling at $8,900 to go for 5 and 6x. And his opponent, Wednesday night, Arkansas, they're kind of a train wreck right now. More on them a little bit later. But they still rank 58th in the nation in tempo, and they still rank 120th in the nation in defense, making them a very solid matchup for fantasy scoring. So I really like Dalton Connect at the top of the board here Wednesday night. Now, on Saturday episodes where I've done the quick picks like this before, I normally divide the mid-tier into 7K to 5K. But I'm going to change my own rules just a bit here, and I'm going to talk about Tyson Walker at 7,300 as my target in the mid-tier. So Tyson Walker has, he kind of one-ups Dalton Connect when it comes to shooting just a little bit. He has a 33% shot rate on the season, and he has taken at least 12 shots in every game in each of the last 2 months. Actually, in each of the last 3 months starting on Valentine's Day. So he just takes a ton of shots, and a ton of shots leads to a lot of fantasy points. And against Penn State, the first time these two teams played, he had it all cooking. He only needed to play 29 minutes to put up 45 fantasy points, was 9 for 14 from the field, 3 for 4 from 3. Just everything you like to see, indicative of him being able to do it again, right? Like he was efficient from the field. He didn't need a ton of minutes. He didn't need really more than his average shots to do it. And so I really like what I saw from him that first time out against Penn State, and I really think he can have a repeat performance there against this same team. Now, if you want to be technical for a mid-tier target, from the 5K to 7K, I think Kanye Clary on the other side of this game has a lot of upside. So, he's coming back from an injury. He's only played 18 and 14 minutes in the last 2 games. But if he were to be back to full strength, he's a really, really solid target at 6,300. And he put up 32 fantasy points against Michigan State the first time on only 10 shots in 33 minutes played. So I think Kanye Clary is a really solid GPP target if you don't want to go after Tyson Walker. However, the fact that he is returning from the injury is a little bit of a concern. If you could tell me right now he was going to play 30 minutes, I'd probably lock him into every lineup. Now, also in the mid-tier, one thing I will mention, because this affects the mid-tier as well as the low tier, is the Miami injuries. So Nigel Pack with an undisclosed injuries list is questionable for this game. And then Keyshawn George missed the last game for Miami. He is also listed as questionable. If one or more of those guys miss, then you are going to see a lot of boosted usage from Matthew Cleveland, Wooga Poplar, and Bensley Joseph. And then you would even see a spot start if both of them missed from Christian Watson sitting at 3K even on the Miami side. So the Miami injuries are going to be one that you're going to need to monitor. And if we do get one or two of those guys out, then that would elevate Cleveland, Poplar, Joseph, and Watson, all in my book. I think they're all four in play if you do get George and Pack out. If it's just one of them out, then I think that would mainly elevate Bensley, Joseph out of anybody else. But I still think you'd see a slight boost to Cleveland and Poplar. Now, heading down to the low tier, we just mentioned Christian Watson, but that's injury dependent. The guy that I'm going to target for the low tier is going to be Keon Manyfield of Arkansas. This is with a little bit of an asterisk, though, because Arkansas is a little bit of a train wreck. Eric Musselman is very frustrated with how things have gone this season for the Razorbacks, and he has been very, I don't think petty is the right word, but very eager to switch up his rotations if somebody is not doing what they are expected to do. And so Keon Manyfield has kind of been the victim of that, but also the beneficiary of that. And so I think there's no guarantee as to what Arkansas does with their rotation, especially at the guard spot. But if you're going off their last game against Georgia, Manyfield played 30 minutes, put up 23 fantasy points on 11 shots, and did so on a 29% usage rate. And so if that's going to continue, you got to really like Manyfield, but man, I just don't know what Arkansas is going to do with this rotation. So he's a really hard click, but at $4,500 on salary, he has a ton of upside if he is able to continue the things that he did well in their last game. All right, so that does it for the guard spot. Let's switch gears just a second, and then we'll talk about the forwards. So now looking at the forward spot, I really do like Janai Broome at the very top of the board, going up against a South Carolina front court that I just don't think is going to have anything for him in terms of defending him or containing him. But the caveat with Janai Broome is you never know how many minutes he's going to play. And I do think in a terrible game environment against South Carolina, he's probably going to need 28 to 30 if he wants to hit value at 9,600. So for a guy that's not exactly minute dependent, let's go ahead and talk about PJ Hall of Clemson. So I think that PJ Hall is a really sneaky play in this game against Miami because in the first time these two teams played, he only put up 23 fantasy points, but he was efficient from the field. He was 6 for 8 from 2, only 1 for 5 from 3, which is not great. And he had 28% usage rate in that game. So when he was out on the court, he was getting used quite a bit. The only thing that really didn't help him was he got in foul trouble early, ended up fouling out of that game, only played 29 minutes, and so that kind of capped him at 23 fantasy points. But the efficiency and the usage are there. We have seen Norchad Omier of Miami struggle to guard taller, bigger centers that can just kind of, go up over him, which is a guy that, PJ Hall fits that description. So I think that if PJ Hall is able to stay out of foul trouble, I think this could be a very good opportunity for a ceiling game from him. And we know he's got a massive ceiling. He's got multiple games over 50, including one over 60 against Georgia Tech about a month ago. And so I do really like PJ Hall in a bounce back spot against Miami. And I'm hoping that a lot of the rest of the public will be off of him because of how he did against them the first time. Now, heading on down the board, you've got Donovan Clingan sitting there at 7,700, and I was on him on Saturday going up against Georgetown. Only played 25 minutes, only took 4 shots and put up 26 fantasy points. I think he's in a very similar boat for DePaul, where this game is going to be a bloodbath, and so he's going to need to do a lot of work in the first half if he wants to put up a lot of fantasy points. But Donovan Clingan doesn't play a ton of minutes anyway, so it's not something I'm super concerned about. I just want to see him get the shots when he's out there, and he really didn't against Georgetown. So Donovan Clingan I see as a high upside GPP type of play, but he's not going to be my official mid-tier or high-tier play. In the mid-tier, there are a few guys that have my interest, such as Malik Hall of Michigan State, who also, like Tyson Walker, had a very successful game the first time against Penn State, putting up 42 fantasy points. And so that is something that I do think you can go back to there. I also like Mekhi Mitchell of Arkansas. We talked about how Arkansas is kind of a train wreck, but Mekhi Mitchell has been a pretty consistent contributor for them the last 4 games with Trayvon Brazile out. He's gone for 40, 40, 20, and 27. And I'll take 27 again at a salary of $6,200. That's absolutely A-okay in my book. But the guy that is my official play in the mid-range is going to be Abu Usman of Xavier, the North Texas transfer. So in the first game against Seton Hall, he put up 49 fantasy points, which was his high of the ceiling. He only needed 30 minutes to get there. He had a double-double, multiple blocks, and just really, really solid performance against Seton Hall. He was really the start of the whole play your bigs against Seton Hall narrative that I've kind of been going back to ever since that game for varying levels of success. And I just think they didn't really have an answer for him. And what I like about Usman, though, is he has shown the ability to hit value in different types of game environments and different types of performances, right? So like you look at Villanova, he played 31 minutes, was 1 for 7 from the field, 25 fantasy points. So he didn't need to be super successful from the field to get there because he played a lot of minutes. But then you look at the St. John's game, earlier in January, he only played 16 minutes, but still put up 21 fantasy points. And so I really like the fact that he can get there, by doing it in a variety of ways. Doesn't need a whole lot of shots, doesn't need to be, super duper efficient. Just what he does with the blocks and the rebounds allows him to, put up fantasy points in bunches. And I love the fact that we're getting him back at a matchup that he had a lot of success with at a price tag that I am very comfortable with paying at $5,500. Now, for the low tier, I think for the first time in like forever, there's actually a lot of value in the low tier at the forward spot, which is not something I say a whole lot. We already talked about the Maryland guys as well as Patrick McCaffrey. So you got those guys already. And then I kind of like Churchill Abbas, who is starting at center for DePaul now. He's been a little up and down, but there's been enough ups that make me willing to go back to him at $4,900. You've got Sean Phillips Jr. of Arizona State, who's a legitimate 7-footer who is now back in the starting lineup after he was injured for the middle part of the season. And he's an over a fantasy point per minute guy. So that's another guy to consider at $4,800. Gaidis Namiksha would be a little bit of a pivot off of Abu Usman if you wanted to do so. Tafara Gapare has been, inserted in the Georgia Tech starting lineup, and he has been kind of like Abbas. He's been up and down, but there's enough ups and enough upside that would have me willing to go back to him at $4,600. But my favorite play in the low tier is actually going to be Jack Clark of Clemson. So he's a transfer from NC State that we saw him as a player similar to this at NC State, and he was priced up at like 5,000-6,000. I believe he even got in the 7K range at one point, right? At his best, Jack Clark is a guy who plays a ton of minutes because he is a great defensive player. He's a good enough three-point shooter, and he's an elite rebounder who can also put up other peripheral stats. Well, that has kind of bared itself out in the last 2 games. He's played 33 and 29 minutes. He's put up 18 and 20 fantasy points in those 2 games with a total of 17 rebounds in those 2 games. And he's only made 3 shots from the field in those 2 games. So if he finally starts, hitting some shots, knocking down some threes, there's a real legitimate ceiling there. And for a guy that's a good rebounder, I love him in a spot like against Miami where you're getting an up-tempo matchup where you're going to have a ton of possessions and a ton of opportunities for him to put up rebounds. I really like Jack Clark as my play in the low tier, and I think that if you want to stack up the Clemson-Miami game, maybe we get some news on some of those injuries. Maybe, there's a clearer path, to some of the Miami guys. I really think he's an elite game stacking piece of that Clemson-Miami game because I think he's a guy that would benefit from the game really getting up and down for those rebounds. All right, so that does it for the forward position, and that does it for our Valentine's Day episode. So show some love to me, please. Please like the video on YouTube as well as rate and review the audio if you like what you heard here on this episode. It really does help me out a lot, and I really do appreciate it. You guys see what I did there with the love on Valentine's Day? Yeah, y'all are lucky Caleb Love isn't on the slate because, boy, I had some puns ready for that one. If you like what you saw here in the video, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season. And we're going to go all the way up through March Madness. We're going to have a ton of previews, ton of episodes coming your way, helping you guys get all the information you need to help build winning DFS lineups. Now, if you want more from me, maybe there's some players you're curious about that I didn't get to in this episode. Maybe you want to know who actually makes my lineups. There's a lot of places where you can get that. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I tweet out all updates from the show on there, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if you reach out to me. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I believe we have the best Discord community in college basketball DFS in the Fantasy Corner. But it's not only college basketball. You can come for college basketball, but we also got golf. We also got NBA. We got a lot of guys that play MLB when that comes back. There's a lot going on in there, and it's a great community with a lot of smart people. And it's a lot of fun to kind of talk it out and then sweat it out together. And so if you're looking for people to talk college basketball DFS with, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. And then lastly, I do write up a full article for every college basketball slate to my Patreon where I profile my core plays as well as my lineup strategy and kind of my build strategy for the slate. And there's not a whole lot of people out there doing that for college basketball. So if you want that information, head on over to patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. It is, the one thing I do that is paid, but the Patreon helps finance a lot of stuff that I do. It helps me pay for all the data sites that help finance, a lot of the stats and a lot of the data that you hear on here, and just helps me pay for tools to kind of help make better content for you guys. So if you want to show some support to the channel, hitting the like button and the subscribe button helps out a lot, and subscribing to the Patreon helps out as well. All right, so that does it for this episode, guys. Like I said, I know it was a little bit of a different format. Let me know what you guys think of the format, because it was a lot easier to set up and record this one on a very short turnaround as opposed to if I would have tried to do a full game-by-game breakdown. So let me know what you think of the format in the comments. And hopefully I was able to give you guys plenty of information that you need to build some successful DFS lineups for this Valentine's Day slate. Best of luck to you. Make sure you take care of your significant others on Valentine's Day. Thank you guys for listening and watching to this point, and I will see you next time.